I appreciate the intro. Thank you. This is certainly the biggest Zoom call I've ever been a part of. So that's exciting. I'm glad everybody could make it. I just want to kind of start, get going, talk about my recovery story, talk about substance use a little bit, and then what that's led to and what we're doing now. My substance use began at a somewhat of an early age, probably around 15 years old. I got introduced to alcohol and marijuana initially. That kind of got started as a social thing, but when I look at what led to sustained substance use and that continuing throughout adulthood, I'm able to kind of identify now that a lot of that got started of treat untreated mental health, right? And so, that consisted of things like depression, it consisted of OCD that at times was really bad. And I didn't even know that that's what it was. I didn't know that it was mental health happening at that time. And so when I kind of started experimenting with alcohol and marijuana, it kind of tended to ease those symptoms a little bit. And once I recognized that that was an out, I took it. I utilized substances to kind of treat some of those things. And as I progressed in age into adulthood, that started to take form in other substances as well. You start looking at, benzodiazepines prescribed to treat anxiety, whether it be, opiates consistent with prescription pain pills or heroin or whatever the case may be. Those things started to progress and, eventually, obviously, it gets out of control. When we're talking about young people experimenting with substance use or treating untreated mental health, we start to look at things like prevention programs in schools, right? So, ARCHway partners with an organization called NCADA. NCADA has a prevention program that operates in over 200 schools. They served over 60,000 kids. And, when I look at some of these programs and think back to my youth, one of the things that those seek to do is to address the stigma associated with mental health and substance use, right? And kind of normalize the conversations around seeking help. And so you start to look at some of these situations, and what you see is that nobody looks at anybody twice for going to the doctor for a sprained ankle, right? But there is still social stigma in our society surrounding mental health treatment services and substance use treatment services. So if we can normalize those conversations starting at a younger age, I think we can mitigate a lot of risk of people progressing in substance use at an older age, right? And unfortunately, the solution I found at that time was not a healthy one, even though at times it was effective, right? And so, you progress a little bit, you get into some more serious substances, benzodiazepines, prescription opiates, heroin, and that's where things for me really started to spiral out of control, right? And so I realized well before I ever sought, professional help treatment services that I needed to stop what I was doing and kind of change my ways. And that resulted in numerous failed attempts at maintaining sobriety just on my own, right? And so eventually in 2013, I went to Centerpoint Hospital. I went through their detox program, and then I went to their 21-day inpatient. While I was there, I was prescribed mental health medications, and I was also prescribed Suboxone, and the way that this was presented to me was saw a physician, written a prescription for Suboxone, and here's your solution to opioid addiction. This is how it works. So I did that. It was successful for a few months until I began to seek out, drugs and alcohol again. That led to having a Suboxone prescription. I went and saw a different physician who prescribed Xanax. I was using recreational drugs like alcohol and cocaine, and finally this all came to a head when, I was driving a motor vehicle, had a seizure and crashed a car, right? I mean, these are serious things where, I could have killed myself, I could have killed somebody else. And, so as a result of that, I ended up in the hospital, right? Fortunately, I had family members there that were willing to help me out and willing to help me find help, and so in 2014, I went to the Assisted Recovery Centers of America's inpatient location. It was called MIRA. While I was there, that was my first introduction to Vivitrol. It was my first introduction to recovery housing. It was my first introduction to peer support and John Stuckey, and so during that stay there, I started to look at my options, and it was the first time I realized like the value that peers bring to the field, because there were two peer support specialists there, John Stuckey and Dave Allmiller. And both of them brought a level of truth into that room with me that a lot of it, honestly, I didn't want to hear at the time. But thankfully, they did bring that to my front door, and kind of drive home flaws in my thinking and the ways in which, I needed to take accountability if I'm going to have the better life that I say that I want to have, right? And so, during that stay, I got educated on the Vivitrol shot, which is a medication that I utilized for years after discharge from that inpatient, right? Vivitrol did a number of things. Number one, it's a non-habit forming medication. And especially in early recovery, what that did for me was, I only had to make a correct decision once every 28 days instead of every single day, right? And that facilitated, not only one, did it alleviate cravings and alleviate the responsibility of making that right choice every day, but it cleared up my thinking. And I'm trying to describe this in the right way, but, if you have a craving to use, that can become like malignant, right? And so with being on Vivitrol, what I realized was, I said, Colton, you can't use today, you can't use tomorrow, you can't use next week, you can't use the week after that. Why don't you start thinking and focusing on what you can do to make your situation better, to make your life better, right? And so, that's been a critical component of my recovery. And, not only does Vivitrol block the opioid receptors in the brain, but it alleviates opioid cravings along with alcohol cravings, and that's been especially effective in, maintaining long-term recovery, not only for myself, but in many, many of the clients that I serve, And so utilizing Vivitrol not only played an integral role in my early recovery, but it had an added layer of protection for my sobriety going forward, right? The other thing that happened during that inpatient stay was I was introduced to transitional housing, right? And so in early November 2014, I went to Recovery House in St. Louis. And, being in recovery housing, for one, it provided an instant, healthy social support network, right? It created a level of accountability through peer support and through other residents of the house, and it was the first time that I saw recovery modeled in a fashion that appeared attractive to me, right? And so, the peer support, the recovery housing really got me to buy into the process and to, seek out the better life. I saw these people who were, they were happy, they were successful in recovery, they were doing things they wanted to do. And it's contagious. You see that and you're like, wow, these people really are happy. These people really are successful in recovery. Like, I can have that too if I'm willing to put in the work. Right. And so, the two people that were managing the recovery house that I moved into at the time was John Stuckey and Dave Allmiller, and they were probably two of the most impactful people that influenced me in this process. Right. And I saw the value that peers have in housing. I saw the value that peers have in the treatment field. And it became very evident to me that that was something that I wanted to do as well. Right. And so the process to doing that initially was, I got given the opportunity to become a manager at Recovery House. Right. And so, being a manager at Recovery House was not a paid position, but it was probably one of the most impactful responsibilities that had been given to me up until that time, just because I know, that when I came into Recovery House, I was pretty broken and I was not in a good place in life, and these guys showed me a way for a better life, and so I told them one day, and I was like, guys, I can't pay you back for this. You know what I'm saying? How do you monetize a human life? And John was like, Colton, I'm good. Pass it on to the next person, and that moment, that statement had a profound impact on not only the way I viewed recovery, but the way in which I wanted to live my life, right? Because, especially in active addiction, everything has a price, and it's you give and take and whatever, but I got into recovery and I had not met many people like John, like Dave, that were in it strictly for, to help another person. And that's where, I've said this numerous times in numerous different talks, but when you help another person that's struggling with no strings attached, I mean, that's priceless, that's one of the things that's brought me joy in the truest sense, just to be able to give back what was freely given to me. Right. And so, I saw that opportunity to become a manager at Recovery House, and I was like, there was nothing I could think of that would be a better use of my time, energy, skills, resources, than that. Through that process, being a manager at Recovery House, through connections at ARCHway, Recovery House, I got put into the peer certification class, right? And so, going into that class and getting an entry-level job in the treatment field, Recovery House and ARCHway kind of built me up. They educated me on recovery. I built my recovery program around that. And then through this entry-level job in the treatment field, I kind of got groomed in a clinical setting, right? Whether it be providing direct services, utilizing EMRs, whatever the case may be. And so, those opportunities led me to, a situation where I was able to work on the EPIC Outreach Project, right? So the EPIC Outreach Project works in the eastern region of Missouri, and we provide services at all SSM, BJC, and Mercy hospitals in the eastern region. We go to emergency departments, behavioral health centers, and medical floors, and provide outreach services to individuals who have either overdosed or have presented with withdrawal symptoms, right? And so, through being the lead coach on the EPIC project, through being a peer with the ARCHway Institute, with MoPros, it's given me the opportunity to, connect hundreds of people to like life-saving care. You know what I mean? And it's, and that's where peers, I think, play like a really critical role, like in this situation, right? Because you have treatment agencies, you have housing agencies, you have medication providers, and the clientele that we're serving cannot navigate the system, right? Like they're not getting connected to the care that they need. And that's where peer supports in the field, and frankly, the ARCHway Institute plays a critical role, right? Because not only can we identify the needs, but we can connect people to like appropriate and quality care. That is something that I've seen since day one in this field that has really failed a lot of people. And so, being a peer in the field, being a peer with ARCHway are, a lot of the things that I'm most passionate about, because, we're able to connect people to the care that they need. I mean, like I'm a perfect example, right? So I was in the hospital. Fortunately, I had family who was willing to call treatment providers, find an inpatient location that was able to take me in. But guess what? If they hadn't made those phone calls and had $500 to get me in the door, you know what I mean? Like a lot of times the difference between recovery and death is $500. And so when we go on these fundraising campaigns for ARCHway, like these are real people. Like this is what these hope funds are about. Like these stories that you see, myself, John, Jordan, Eric, Chase, all these guys like would not have received the care that they need without these connections and without this financial support, right? And so I'm not going to get on my soapbox about fundraising, but I'm just saying it's critical to be able to connect people to life-saving care, right? I see you, Dan. See you, Jan. And so working with ARCHway, working with the MoPros Coalition, and Recovery House as well, one of the things that I think is the most important is advocating for the peer movement itself, right? And making this movement sustainable. Because, I know the inherent value that peers bring to the field and the clientele that they serve, the treatment teams that they're a part of, the outreach programs that they facilitate, right? But like without organizations like ARCHway and MoPros advocating for this care, advocating for for evidence-based research, right? Like it's not sustainable. It's not reimbursable by insurance policies, and a lot of times hiring and firing of peers happens with the ebb and flow of grant funding, right? And so advocating for peers, advocating for their inherent value, and kind of facilitating these things is one of the things that I'm most passionate about in this process. And just to get on my soapbox a little bit about MoPros, MoPros advocates for not only the peer support movement, not only for the sustainability of peers and peers looking out for peers, but we're also advocating for the clientele that we serve, right? Too many times I see clientele in this field fall through the cracks. They fall through the cracks. They don't get connected to the services that they need, right? And so advocating for access to treatment, access to housing, providing client-centered long-term care, right? Informed consent on their treatment plans, equal access to all medications. Like I am a very fortunate individual that I was plugged into the people that I was plugged into when I was. That includes John Stuckey, Dave Allmiller, the Stuckeys, ARCHway Institute, Recovery House, but I am one person that's trying to live as an example of this thing, right? But I have hundreds and thousands of other people seeking help that are probably not getting the same opportunities that I was presented with, right? And so through ARCHway, through MoPros, through Recovery House. Like, these are things that we're advocating for, to be able to serve our populations, our communities, right? This stuff doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? These are your neighbors, your friends, their kids, whatever, right? And so being able to do these things, being able to be on this Zoom call, having us all here tonight is exciting. I'm glad that we were able to put this thing together. I'm sorry it wasn't in person, but this is the best we could do, all right? Hashtag COVID-19. So I would love to open it up for questions if anybody has any. Unmute yourself at the top corner, and we can do that.